At 21, Maren Solis had $11, a duffel bag with a broken zipper, and a warrant for the eviction of the only address she'd called home in 2 years. She was standing outside a county auction house in the November rain when a clerk in a yellow vest held up a deed to a rusted seafood cannery on the Oregon coast and asked if anyone would take it off the state's hands for back taxes owed. Nobody raised a hand. Maren raised hers. The final price was $8. Everyone in that room thought she was either desperate or delusional, and they weren't entirely wrong. But 3 weeks later, when she finally forced open the door to the freezer room in the back of the building, the one that had been sealed since her great-aunt Dorothy died, she found something that had been waiting there for a long time. Something her great-aunt had spent 30 years quietly preparing, for a girl she'd only met twice, and believed in anyway. Maren had been sleeping in her car for 11 days when the car was repossessed. That part happened on a Tuesday. She'd parked on a side street in Coos Bay, the kind of neighborhood where nobody looks too hard at what doesn't belong, and when she came back from the gas station restroom at 7 in the morning, the car was gone. A clean space on the curb where a life's worth of packed-in necessities had been, her winter coat in the back seat, her community college textbooks, the tin box she kept under the passenger seat with the $11 she'd been rationing for 2 weeks. The tow company had the car. She didn't have the money to get it out, and she knew without calling that they also had the tin box, which meant she had $11 in her jacket pocket and the duffel bag she'd been carrying over her shoulder when it happened. She sat on the curb for a while. This was not a low point she could have predicted 3 years earlier, when she'd been a sophomore at Oregon State with a scholarship and a plan. She'd been studying environmental science, drawn to it the way you're drawn to the thing you can't stop reading about even when you have other things to do, and she was good at it. Her advisor told her in February of her second year that she was one of the stronger students in the program and that she should be thinking about research opportunities in the summer. She had been thinking about research opportunities in the summer. She'd been thinking about a lot of things. The plan had been her mother's plan as much as hers, built on the assumption that Maren would finish her degree, that her mother would stay stable, that the things people arranged their lives around would hold. None of them held. Her mother's illness had been managed for years, the word managed carrying all the weight of what it didn't say, but it came back in the fall of Maren's second year with the specific seriousness that means the managing isn't working anymore. There were hospital stays. There were decisions that couldn't wait. The scholarship terms required enrollment, and enrollment required being on campus, and being on campus required not being in Roseburg 3 days a week driving her mother to appointments and making sure the gas was on. Maren had gone home to help. She told herself she would return in the spring. Spring came, and her mother was better but not stable. Stable meant something precise in medical terms, and her mother wasn't meeting the precision. Maren stayed. She got the warehouse job, which paid enough to cover groceries and her mother's prescription copies and the utility bills that tended to accumulate in bad months. The scholarship had lapsed. There was a form she could file to request reinstatement, but filing required a documented medical hardship exception, and navigating the paperwork felt impossible from inside the thing it was supposed to document. Spring became summer. Summer became fall. Maren stopped calling her advisor back. The apartment in Roseburg was in both their names, which was a pragmatic decision from 3 years earlier that turned into a liability in the fall when her mother lost the job that had been technically providing the income that technically justified the lease. The landlord was not unkind, but he was precise, and his precision meant a written notice in October and a court date in November, and an eviction in December that was final and binding regardless of the circumstances that had led to it. Her mother went to her sister's house in Medford. It was complicated in ways that couldn't be resolved quickly, the kind of family complicated that has been complicated for years and doesn't simplify under pressure, but her aunt had a spare room and her mother had no better option. She left on a Thursday with 2 suitcases and the kitchen table that had been their grandmother's. Maren had nowhere to go. She packed what fit in the 2004 Honda Accord, which wasn't much. But the Honda had a back seat that flattened down and room for a sleeping bag and a milk crate of essentials, and for 4 months it had been her address. She'd kept it running with the kind of attention you give a thing when you can't afford to replace it, checking the oil weekly, listening to the engine, knowing which idiosyncrasies to accommodate and which to worry about. She'd driven up the coast in November looking for work in the fishing industry. She had the environmental science background and some knowledge of marine biology, and she thought it might be useful. She'd found the dock work in Coos Bay by asking at the harbor master's office and getting sent to a dispatcher who needed extra hands during surge periods. She'd been surviving, not well, but surviving. She'd owned that car for 4 months before it was taken. Coos Bay was a working town. It smelled like brine and diesel, and the paper mill that ran north of downtown. Fishing boats left before dawn and came back in the late afternoon. The docks were active in a way that felt nothing like the rest of the town, which had been losing population for a decade, and showed it in the empty storefronts on the main street and the half-finished renovation projects that ran out of money halfway up the second floor. Marin had come to Coos Bay for a job interview that didn't lead to a job. She'd stayed because she had nowhere better to go and because the weather, when it wasn't raining, was the kind of gray-green and salt-heavy that felt honest in a way she couldn't explain. She'd been surviving on food pantry meals and the occasional shift at a fish processing dock when the dispatcher needed extra hands. She didn't have an address. The dock work paid in cash, and she didn't ask about schedules because there weren't any. The county auction was being held in the Civic Center parking lot. She'd passed the sign 3 times that week and stopped reading it because auctions were for people with money, and money was the thing she most conspicuously lacked. But on that Tuesday morning, sitting on the curb with $11 and a broken zipper duffel bag, she read the sign all the way through. Delinquent tax properties. Bidding starts at outstanding balance. Most of the lots that morning went fast. A commercial building downtown opened at $40,000 and closed at $82,000. A residential parcel went to a man in a down vest who was on his phone the entire time. Marin stood at the back of the small crowd with her duffel bag and watched properties pass through in minutes for sums she couldn't have imagined possessing. Then the clerk held up a packet with a photograph paperclip to the front. Lot 44, he said. Commercial cannery structure, Coos County, Tilden Road. 3,000 square feet with attached cold storage. Delinquent property taxes of $8.14 outstanding. That's the minimum bid. He waited. Nobody raised their hand. The man in the down vest looked at the photograph and shook his head. The woman beside him said something about asbestos. 2 men near the front exchanged a glance and looked away. Marin raised her hand. The clerk stared at her. You're bidding $8. $8.14, she said. He looked around the lot. Nobody countered. He stamped the packet and slid it toward her across the folding table. It took her 40 minutes to walk to Tilden Road from the Civic Center. The road ran along the edge of the bay, south of the active docks, past a stretch of abandoned equipment and overgrown chain-link fencing. The building appeared around a bend in the road the way things appear in fog, gradually, and then all at once. The cannery was long and low, built in the 1940s from corrugated steel siding and timber framing. A concrete loading dock ran the length of the front face, its edge crumbling where freeze and thaw had worked through the joints. 2 large bay doors on rollers sat rusted open, exposing a dim interior. A smaller entrance door on the south end was closed, padlocked with a hasp that had started to pull away from the rotting door frame. Blackberry vines had made a serious effort at the east wall and were beginning to succeed. The roof, visible from the road, showed one long section of ridge sag that suggested either structural trouble or a very bad decade. But the walls were standing. All of them. Marin walked the perimeter before she tried the door. The building sat on a concrete slab that was cracked but intact. The steel siding was rust-streaked but not eaten through. A narrow channel of water ran behind the building toward the bay, where old pilings still stood from some earlier era of operation. A dented metal sign above the main bay doors read Solly's Pacific in letters Marin had to read twice because of the rust, and then a third time because of what they said. Solly's Pacific. She'd known her great-aunt Dorothy Solly's had owned a cannery. She'd known it the way you know things about relatives you've met twice, which is to say incompletely and without context. Her mother had mentioned it once or twice, dismissively, the way her mother mentioned most things that didn't connect to the immediate emergency of whatever that week required. A cannery up the coast. Your great-aunt's place. Nobody goes out there. She'd never explained why. The padlock gave way when Marin tried one of the keys on the ring the county clerk had included in the packet, not the first key or the second. The fourth. It turned with a grinding resistance and then opened, and the door swung inward on hinges that protested the movement. Inside, the air was cold and damp and smelled of salt and metal, and something underneath both that she couldn't name immediately. Fish, yes, but old fish, the ghost of fish. Decades of processing brine worked into the concrete floor, and the timber posts, and the steel siding in a way that couldn't be cleaned out no matter how long the building sat empty. The floor was poured concrete, sloped toward a central drain. Long steel tables ran the length of the room, still in place, still bolted to the floor, their surfaces rough with old rust and mineral deposit. The overhead light fixtures were dead, their fluorescent tubes cold and dark, but enough gray-white light came through the high east-facing windows to see by. The building was one long, open room divided by use. The processing floor occupied the first two-thirds, 12 feet of ceiling over the tables and the drainage channels, with hooks and a pulley system still rigged above the central table for hanging fish. The far third held the shelving and the cold storage door and a narrow wooden staircase climbing to a loft that Marin could see partially from the floor, a rope railing, a folded cot, a dark window looking north toward the water. Dorothy's quarters, where she'd lived in the building's last years. Along the back wall, a row of hooks still held aprons. Heavy rubber, the color they turn when they've been wet and dried 10,000 times. 3 aprons on 3 hooks, the middle one slightly smaller than the others. They hung in the exact attitude of someone who had stepped out of them and would be back. On the processing table nearest the door, a pair of work gloves sat exactly where someone had set them down. Thick canvas with rubber palms, the right one turned slightly on its side, as if set down mid-task. Beside the gloves, a glass jar with a blue metal lid, filled with something amber, honey or preserves, still sealed, the lid band unrusted despite everything. And beside the jar, a photograph tucked under the glass without a frame, protected by it. A woman Marin didn't recognize standing on the loading dock in bright sun, squinting and smiling, holding up a large silver fish with both hands. Marin picked up the photograph. The woman was maybe 60 in the picture, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with gray hair pulled back under a cap. She was grinning the way people grin when they've just done something they're proud of. Not posed, not performed. The grin of someone who didn't know they were being watched and wouldn't have changed anything if they had. On the back of the photograph, in blue ballpoint, Dorothy Solly's Chinook Salmon, August 1997. Good day. She set the photograph back under the jar. She stood at the processing table for a while. She wasn't planning anything. She wasn't thinking in the way that involves conclusions and next steps. She was doing the thing you do in a space that asks you to be still, which is stay still, and let it tell you what it is. The building made sounds. The steel siding moved in the wind off the bay, a low metal complaint that was almost rhythmic. Water ran somewhere below the slab, not inside the building but under it, the channel making its way to the bay through the geology beneath the concrete. The overhead pulley system swayed almost imperceptibly in the draft from the door she'd left open behind her. Marin walked the length of the processing floor slowly. She ran a hand along the first table. The surface was rough with oxidation, but solid beneath it, good steel, the industrial kind built to last. She tested the edge of the drainage channel with her toe. The concrete was intact, the channel still sloped correctly toward the central drain. Whatever else had failed here, the engineering had held. She climbed the narrow staircase to the loft. The space up top was small and purposeful. The cot was folded against the wall with a wool blanket on the frame, still folded. A wooden chair sat beside a window that looked out on the channel, its seat worn smooth in the center from years of use. A small shelf bolted to the wall held a battery lantern, a tin cup, and 3 books that had been there long enough for their spines to fade. On the windowsill, a small, smooth stone, the kind you pick up at the waterline because it fits exactly right in the palm. Marin picked up the stone. It was cold and gray-green and perfectly oval, worn down by whatever water had shaped it over whatever span of time. She turned it over. Nothing written on it, just a stone that someone had found worth keeping. She climbed back down. The shelving on the east wall held more than she'd first understood. She counted the rows. Dozens of large glass jars, the old wire bale kind with rubber gaskets, still on the shelves in rows. Some were empty, many weren't. Preserved fish, smoked salmon, most of them packed tight and sealed and labeled in blue ballpoint on strips of masking tape. Chinook 1999, Coho 2001, smoked albacore 2003. Others held preserves. Salal berry jam. Pickled sea beans. Crabapple jelly in a rust orange that still held its color. Something labeled simply Dorothy's Relish, 2004, with a small drawing of a fish in the corner. The labels went up to 2008. She wasn't sure why. Something about the wire, the deliberateness of it, the way it looked like a decision rather than an accident, made her wait. She unrolled her sleeping bag on one of the steel tables, used her duffel bag as a pillow, and lay listening to the wind off the bay pressing against the corrugated walls, and the distant sound of a fishing boat coming in late. She didn't sleep well, but she slept inside, and that was something. She was awake before the light changed. The building was gray, dark, and cold, and the smell of brine was stronger in the morning, the way cold makes smells settle. She sat up on the table and looked at the processing floor, the aprons on their hooks, the jar with the blue lid, the work gloves turned sideways on the table. She needed to understand what she had. She started with the open shelving along the east wall. Dozens of large glass jars, the old wire bale kind with rubber gaskets, still on the shelves in rows. Some were empty, many weren't. Preserved fish, smoked salmon, most of them, packed tight and sealed and labeled in blue ballpoint on strips of masking tape. Chinook 1999. Coho 2001. Smoked albacore 2003. Others held preserves. Salal berry jam, pickled sea beans. Crabapple jelly in a rust orange that still held its color. Something labeled simply Dorothy's Relish 2004 with a small drawing of a fish in the corner. The labels went up to 2008. Marin pulled the 2004 relish down and looked at it. The jar was cold in her hands from the unheated building. Dorothy had died in 2009. Someone at the pantry had mentioned it once. Old woman who ran a cannery south of town. Last of the independent operations. Died in the winter. She had a daughter somewhere, but they were estranged. Nobody knew who got the property. The state of Oregon, apparently. Marin put the jar back on the shelf and walked to the steel table where Dorothy's photograph was tucked under the honey jar. She looked at the woman for a long time. She was here. She didn't know why, exactly. She'd raised her hand at the auction because she had $8 and had literally nowhere to go, and the phrase 3,000 square feet had registered somewhere below conscious thought as better than the curb. But standing in this building that bore her family name, looking at the photograph of a woman she had never properly known, something shifted. Not a plan, not a decision, something quieter than both. She put the photograph in her jacket pocket and went to find what Coos Bay offered in the way of help. The food pantry was called Harbor Light, and it ran out of a converted shipping container on the dock road, open 3 mornings a week. When Marin pushed open the door, a woman was lifting boxes of canned goods from a dolly onto a shelf, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this exact task 10,000 times and had made peace with the fact that it would need doing 10,000 more. The woman was in her early 60s, with close-cropped natural hair going silver at the temples and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She turned when she heard the door. "Morning," she said. "Breakfast boxes are on the table. Dinner bags on the left shelf, one per household per visit." "I'm not a household," Marin said. "I'm just me." The woman looked at her, not the quick assessment that meant how bad is this, but the slower kind that meant let me actually see you. "Vera Ackhafer," she said. She extended a hand. "Marin Solis." Vera's expression shifted. "Solis, Dorothy Solis's family. She was my great-aunt. I didn't know her well." Vera set the box she was holding on the shelf and turned around fully. "I knew Dorothy for 20 years. I'm sorry for your loss." She paused. "It's a bit late for condolences, I suppose. How long have you been in Coos Bay?" 6 weeks. "Where are you staying?" Marin told her. "Not all of it, but enough. The car, the auction, the cannery on Tilden Road." Vera was quiet for a moment. "You bought her building. For $8. Vera looked at her with an expression Marin couldn't read. It wasn't pity and it wasn't surprise. It was something closer to recognition. "Come sit down," Vera said. "I'll make coffee." The coffee was strong and came in a mug with a lighthouse on it. They sat at a folding table pushed against the container wall, with daylight coming through a ventilation screen and the sound of a forklift working somewhere on the dock outside. Vera held her mug with both hands and looked at the table while she organized what she was going to say. "Dorothy came to this pantry for the last 4 years of her life," she said. "Not to take, she brought things. Jars from the cannery, fish she'd caught herself, preserves she made from whatever she could forage along the shore road. She was in her late 70s and still putting up 30 jars a season. What happened to the business? The cannery closed in 2006. Commercial fishing had been declining for years, and the processing contracts went to the larger operations in Newport. Dorothy kept it running on her own for almost 2 years after the last workers left, handling the small contracts herself. Then the contracts dried up too. Vera sipped her coffee. She stayed in the building. I think she had a room set up in the back. She wouldn't leave. Was there family? She had a daughter, Patris. They stopped speaking sometime around 2005. I don't know the particulars. Patris lives in Portland, I think. She didn't come for the funeral." Vera set her mug down. "Dorothy talked about family sometimes, about a sister's children and grandchildren. About a girl she hoped to hear from someday. She looked at Marin. I think that was you. Marin looked at the lighthouse mug in her own hands. She never tried to contact me. Maybe she didn't think she'd be welcome. People like Dorothy, the ones who give everything away quietly, they tend not to push. They leave the door and they wait. Marin was quiet. Through the ventilation screen she could hear the foghorn out in the channel, low and regular, the sound of the coast doing what it always did regardless of what any person decided to do next. She left something in the freezer room, Marin said. It's sealed with wire, looked deliberate. Vera nodded slowly. I suspected she might have. What's in it? I don't know, Dorothy never said. But the last time I saw her, the week before she died, she told me she'd put her affairs in order and that the only thing she regretted was not getting to see how it turned out. Vera looked at her steadily. She didn't explain that, she just said it. I've thought about it since. Marin drove back to the cannery along the Bay Road in Vera's truck, which Vera had insisted on lending when she learned Marin didn't have a car and the cannery was a mile and a half from town. She parked on the cracked concrete apron in front of the bay doors and sat for a moment with the engine off. The cannery looked different in the afternoon light. Not less ruined, but less random. The sag in the roof was real. The blackberries were real. But the walls were solid, and the slab was solid, and the shelves inside still held 30 years of preserved things waiting for someone to use them. Marin got out and went inside. She walked the length of the processing floor to the back wall and stood in front of the sealed steel door. The wire through the handle was wrapped twice and knotted. She worked the knot loose with her fingers. It took a minute. The wire dropped free and she set it on the floor. She pulled the lever handle. The seal gasket resisted, then let go with a soft pop like a jar lid breaking vacuum. The freezer room was about 12 feet square. The cooling equipment had been dead for years, and the room was simply cold from proximity to the bay on the north side. Metal shelving units ran 2 walls. A single industrial light fixture hung from the ceiling, dark. Marin used the flashlight she'd borrowed with the truck. The shelves held more jars, more preserves, more fish, but the center of the room held something else. A wooden workbench had been built against the north wall. Solid construction, heavy timber legs with a thick plank top. On the bench sat a steel document box, the fireproof kind, with a handle and combination lock, and beside it, a mason jar packed with folded papers and tied with kitchen string, and beside that, a tackle box that Marin recognized as old by the particular orange of its plastic. She opened the tackle box first. Inside, layered under hooks and sinkers she'd never use, was a flat envelope. She pulled it out. Photographs, a stack of them. Marin's mother as a teenager, standing somewhere Marin didn't recognize with a woman she would later understand, was Dorothy, young and laughing. Her mother at maybe 20, on the loading dock of this cannery, holding up a jar and grinning the exact grin from Dorothy's Chinook salmon photograph. A photograph Marin had never seen of herself, maybe 5 years old, on what looked like a beach. She had no memory of this, no memory at all being held by the same older woman. She turned that last photograph over. Marin, age 5, she has her mother's chin in her grandmother's hands, she'll be fine. Marin sat on the concrete floor of the freezer room with the photograph spread in her lap and the flashlight balanced on the shelf above her. Fine, she'd been a lot of things in the last 2 years. Fine hadn't been one of them. She opened the mason jar. The papers inside were receipts, dozens of them, folded small. She unfolded them one by one. Grocery receipts from decades back with notes written on the blank side. Sent Claire $200 for February rent. She won't know it was me, don't want her to feel the weight of it. A utility bill from 2001 with a note, called the gas company, paid Claire's account forward 2 months. She needs to get ahead, not stay even. Medical receipts from 2003, from 2005, from 2007, each one annotated, Claire's prescription. Mailed cash. She'll think it's from the church. Marin sat in the cold room and read every slip. Her mother's name on all of them. Money sent quietly, bills paid anonymously, gaps filled without acknowledgement or expectation of return. Not hundreds of dollars, thousands, and none of it ever mentioned. None of it ever known. Her mother had spent Marin's childhood thinking she was barely keeping her head above water. And this woman Marin had met twice, who had stood on a loading dock holding a silver fish and grinned like life was worth the trouble, had been swimming beneath the surface the whole time, keeping the water from rising. She reached for the document box last. The combination was the address, Tilden Road. She found that written on a piece of masking tape stuck to the bottom of the box. Inside were 2 documents in clear plastic sleeves. The first was a deed. The property at Tilden Road, Coos County. Dorothy Aliner Solis, sole owner, transferring title to Maren Lynn Solis, granddaughter of Dorothy's sister Helene Solis, to take effect upon filing with the county recorder. Undated, unsigned, waiting. The second document was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten on graph paper in a careful, slanted hand. My dear Maren, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll ever find your way to this building, or if you do, whether you'll care about any of what I've left here. But I wrote it down because the alternative was carrying it out of the world with me, and I didn't want to do that. I need to start with your mother. Claire was 19 when she first showed up on my dock. This would have been 1979. She'd driven herself up the coast from Roseburg with nothing but a backpack and a story she hadn't finished telling herself yet, and she sat on my loading dock eating a tin of crackers and looking at the bay like she was deciding something. I brought her coffee and didn't ask questions. She stayed 3 months. She helped me through the salmon season and learned to seal a jar and fix a broken gasket and navigate the cold room without slipping. She was good with her hands and better with her attention. She left in November and I missed her the way you miss a season. She wrote to me for years. I watched her life go sideways and come back and go sideways again. I did what I could from a distance. I was never very good at closeness, the way some people aren't very good at it, not from coldness, but from not wanting to burden what they love with their presence. It's a flaw I recognize and have not corrected. I met you once, the summer you were 5. Your mother brought you up for a weekend. You walked the length of the processing floor without touching a single table and then looked up at me and said, "What do they make here?" I told you. You considered the answer and said, "Can they make something else?" I told you I supposed they could make whatever anyone needed. You nodded and said, "Good," and went to look at the bay. I have thought about that conversation almost every week since. I am leaving you this building not because it has value in the conventional sense, because it has very little, but because you asked the right question before you knew there was any reason to. Whatever you decide to make here, you have my permission and my hope. You do not owe me anything. No one I helped ever owed me anything. The whole point was that it was freely given. I know you'll have a hard road to this door. If you are reading this, you have already come through something that would have stopped many people. I am sorry I wasn't there for it. The deed is ready for your signature. The building is yours. The coffee maker is in the cabinet above the second shelf in the stockroom. I bought it new in 2008 and never had enough visitors to justify it. Make something, Maren, that's all. With love that doesn't require your belief in it to be real, Dorothy Maren sat in the cold room for a long time. She read the letter twice more. She read it until the handwriting was as familiar as her own. She read it until Dorothy's voice had shape and weight, and the particular warmth of someone who had always known the ending and was only waiting for the beginning to catch up. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the document box, and carried everything out to the processing floor. She found the coffee maker in the stockroom exactly where Dorothy had said it would be, in the cabinet above the second shelf. She plugged it into the outlet by the back wall. The power had been off to the building for years. The county had cut it when the taxes lapsed. But there was a line she could trace to the utility box outside, and she made a note to call about restoration. For now, she had a building, a name on a deed. And 30 years of receipts proving that someone had thought she was worth the trouble long before she'd had the chance to prove it herself. She went to find Vera. Vera's truck was still outside when Maren came back to the food pantry. She found Vera on the dock road loading empty boxes into her vehicle, moving with the same steady, unhurried efficiency she'd brought to everything. Maren held out the photographs. Vera looked at them one at a time. She lingered on the photograph of young Claire on the loading dock. "That's her daughter," she said. "She has her eyes." "That's my mother." Vera looked up. "Dorothy sent her money for years," Maren said. "Anonymously, bills, groceries, rent, my mother never knew." Vera was quiet for a moment. She handed the photographs back. "No," she said, "I suppose she wouldn't have. She left the building to me." Vera looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Are you going to stay?" Maren looked at the bay. The water was gray-green in the late afternoon light, moving the way it always moved, the way it moved regardless of what anyone built on its shore or walked away from or returned to. The fog was coming in from the south. You could see it in the way the horizon blurred. "I don't know how to run a cannery," Maren said. "Neither did Dorothy the first year." Vera leaned on the side of her truck. "She learned. I need to restore the power, fix the roof. I don't have money for any of it. You have the building, and you have a name that means something in this town." Vera crossed her arms. "Let me make some calls." That was how it started. A mason jar of receipts, a photograph of a 5-year-old saying, "Can they make something else?" and a woman named Vera Acaffer making phone calls. The first call was to a retired electrician named Dwayne Pratt, who had operated a fishing boat for 30 years and had once, during a particularly bad season, received a cannery contract from Dorothy that had kept him solvent through the winter. She'd given him a contract she didn't strictly need to give him, paying a higher-than-market rate for his catch on the grounds that she believed the quality justified it, which her accountant disputed and her conscience didn't. Dwayne had never forgotten. He showed up the next morning in a van with his tools and his son, and said he'd have the power restored by Tuesday. The second call was to a roofing contractor named B. Margulies, who ran a crew out of her garage and who had learned her trade from her grandfather, a man who had sold his fish exclusively to Solly's Pacific for 20 years, because Dorothy paid fair when everyone else was paying low. He'd told that story every Thanksgiving until he died, the year the contracts dried up and Dorothy had still found a way to give him work patching the cannery roof even though the roof didn't strictly need patching. Bea had grown up knowing what the Solly's name meant. She came out, walked the ridge line, and quoted Marin a price that was half what the work was worth. "I'm not in a position to take charity," Marin said. "It's not charity," Bea said. "It's debt settlement, different accounting." She said it the way someone says something they've thought about more than once. The third call Vera made was to the harbor master, who posted a notice about the cannery reopening that Marin hadn't asked her to post and wasn't entirely sure she'd earned yet. But people started showing up. They came the way people come to things in small working towns, without fanfare, carrying things. An older man arrived with a generator and the information that it had been sitting in Dorothy's barn behind the property, still under a tarp, and was probably still serviceable. It was. Two women from the fish processing co-op brought cleaning supplies and spent a Saturday morning scrubbing the processing tables, working in the companionable silence of people who have cleaned a lot of things together and don't need to talk through it. A teenager who worked at the bait shop came by on his lunch break to fix the bay door roller that had rusted off its track, climbed down from the door with grease on both hands, and said Dorothy had let him shelter in the loading dock once during a bad storm when he was 11 and walking home from school. He stayed until the door was done and then left without asking for anything. A retired marine mechanic named Gerald Ash drove over from Bandon on a Thursday and stood in front of the cold storage compressor for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said he could source the parts if Marin could tell him what she planned to use it for. "Preservation," Marin said. He nodded. He drove back to Bandon to look up the parts. He was back Friday with a list of what he needed and two of the parts already. Vera brought food. Not as charity either, she was clear about that, but as a practical acknowledgement that Marin was working 12-hour days and needed calories. She came 3 mornings a week with a container of something and sat on the loading dock while Marin ate it, asking questions about the building and the notebooks and how the canning class had gone, and telling Marin things about Dorothy that filled in the edges of what the receipts had only outlined. Dorothy had run a holiday dinner from the cannery loading dock every year for the last 15 years of the cannery's operation. She'd cooked it herself, starting November 1st, working with whatever the season had left in terms of preserved goods, and she'd put out word through the churches and the pantry and the harbor that anyone who needed a plate on Christmas should come to Tilden Road. She never advertised it formally. She didn't want people to feel they were accepting charity. She said they were accepting dinner, which was a different thing, and she made that distinction pointedly to anyone who tried to reframe it. One year, Vera said, she served 47 people from this loading dock, 47 with a 2-burner camp stove and a borrowed chafing dish and a kitchen full of what she'd put up since September. Did anyone ever help her? She never asked for help with that, it was hers. She was particular about it. Vera sipped her coffee. The year before she died, she couldn't stand long enough to cook it. She sat in a chair on the dock and told people what to do and they did it. 6 or 7 of us. None of us had ever cooked for 47 people and we made every mistake she didn't make. But the food came out and the people came and she sat in that chair and watched it happen and was satisfied. Vera looked out at the bay. I think she wanted to see that it would keep going without her. That's what I think. She needed to know the door would stay open. Marin was quiet. Will it? She asked. The dinner. Vera looked at her. You're asking me. I'm asking if you think it should. Vera considered this with the careful attention she brought to things that mattered. I think Dorothy left the right person in the building, she said. So yes, I think it will. What Marin didn't tell Vera yet was that she'd found something that morning that made the whole question of the dinner, and the building, and the title feel suddenly precarious. She'd been going through the county documents that had come with the deed packet from the auction, a bundle of paperwork she'd been putting off because paperwork in a damp building with no power had seemed like a lower priority than roof and electricity and heat. She'd spread the documents on the processing table in the morning light and worked through them systematically. Two-thirds of the way through the bundle, she found the title chain summary. The language was dense, and she'd had to read it 3 times. The summary showed the property's title history going back to original conveyance. The property had passed from the county land grant to a man named Harlan Solis in 1919, from Harlan Solis to his son Roy in 1947, from Roy to his daughter Dorothy in 1971, clear and unbroken for 50 years. Then, in 2006, a notation she hadn't expected. Dorothy had taken a loan against the property, a commercial lien from a private lending company, $22,000, for what the records listed as operational capital. The lien had been recorded but never formally released. And the private lending company, she had to look it up, sitting on the concrete floor with the county document in her hands, had been acquired in 2018 by a real estate holding firm based in Portland. The loan was old. The lien was possibly expired under Oregon statute, but possibly was not certainly, and if the lien holder had standing, the title that was already in a complicated position because of the unsigned deed might be in an additionally complicated position because of this. She folded the document and sat with it. If you've stayed this long in Marin's story, stay a little longer. The part that changes everything is just ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The envelope from the development firm arrived 3 weeks later. What she knew was this: the shelving on the east wall held 43 jars of preserved goods that Dorothy had made in the last years of the cannery's operation. Some of them were 20 years old and still sealed. She'd tasted the 2004 relish, and it was extraordinary, brined and bright and tasting of the specific coast where it had been made. The albacore from 2001 fell apart in clean flakes and smelled like smoke and cold salt water. Whatever Dorothy had known about preservation, she had known it completely. She found Dorothy's notebooks in the stockroom. 3 of them, lined composition books filled with recipes and notes and adjustments going back decades. Pacific crab, pressure can 90 min at 10 pounds. Smoked coho, alder chips, low heat 6 hours. Each recipe tested and revised across multiple seasons, marked with the year of each adjustment and a brief assessment. Better, too sweet. Gelled right this time. The notebooks were a working record of 30 years of learning what the coast could offer and how to keep it. Marin spent 3 evenings reading them cover to cover. She called her mother on the 4th day. It was the first call she'd made on the phone Vera had lent her, a prepaid she'd picked up at the hardware store when the dock work money came through. The call connected to Medford to her aunt's landline, and her mother answered on the 3rd ring. Marin. Hi, Mom. Silence on both ends. This was the texture of their calls now, the silence that held all the things they'd tried to say and failed to say and would probably keep trying. I'm in Coos Bay, Marin said. I found something I need to tell you about. She told her, not quickly. She took her time with it, the way you take time with something that has been sealed for 30 years and needs air. Her mother was quiet through most of it. When Marin read the portion of Dorothy's letter about Claire on the dock, about the backpack and the bay and the season of salmon work, her mother made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite anything else. She paid your rent, Marin said. For years, she paid your bills, she told no one. I looked for that person, her mother said. I looked for years, I thought it was the church, I thought it was the county program, her voice broke and came back. I thanked her in a letter once to the county program administrator, I don't know if it ever got to her. The receipts are here, I'll take photographs. Her mother was quiet. She barely knew me. She knew you. Another silence longer. Is the building? I'm fixing it. Marin looked up through the bay door at the sky above the corrugated steel roof, which had been patched that morning by Bee's crew, the new shingles bright and pale against the old weathered ones. Slowly, I'm fixing it. Her mother said she wanted to come. Marin said, come. She was 3 weeks into the restoration when the envelope arrived. It came in a bundle of forwarded mail that the county records office had been holding since the tax proceedings, and Marin found it on a Thursday morning when she went to collect it. The return address was a real estate development firm in Portland. The letter inside was addressed to current occupant/property owner, Tilden Road, Coos County. She read it standing at the mail counter. The firm represented a buyer interested in the Tilden Road property for commercial waterfront redevelopment. They had been monitoring the property for some time, a word that meant something specific when applied to a property you didn't own. They were prepared to make an offer contingent on clean title. Current cash offer, $47,000. The offer was time-sensitive and would expire in 14 days. They encouraged an expeditious response. Marin folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket. She went back to the cannery and found Vera sitting on the loading dock drinking coffee with Dwayne, who had come by to check on the electrical work and had developed a habit of not leaving until after the second cup. She handed Vera the letter without preamble. Vera read it. Dwayne read over her shoulder. 47,000, Dwayne said. That's not nothing. No, Marin said. You thinking about it? Marin looked at the bay. The tide was out and the mud flats were exposed, black and teeming with the small, industrious life of the shore. A heron stood motionless at the channel edge, waiting. No, she said. Vera handed the letter back. Then you should know they'll try again. She was right. The second letter arrived 9 days later. The offer had risen to $61,000. A different attorney's name on the letterhead, which told Marin they'd escalated internally. The letter mentioned quiet title concerns and the complexity of the recent tax transfer and potential challenges to the deed's validity. And there was a new element, a reference to a commercial lien on the property recorded in 2006, which the firm claimed its client had acquired through the purchase of the original lending company. That was the piece she'd found in the title chain summary 3 weeks earlier, folded on the processing table. She'd already told Tomas Reyes about it. She told him about it the same day she'd found it, because waiting felt like the wrong response to something that felt like a ticking. He'd asked for the document number and gone quiet for 10 minutes. The lien is real, he said when he came back. The acquisition chain is real, but the original note was for 10 years with a 15-year sunset clause on the enforcement rights. Under Oregon's commercial lien statute, the firm has a window to assert it, but it's narrow. He'd been measuring his words carefully, which was either very good or complicated. Here's the thing. If they're mentioning this lien in an offer letter, they think it gives them leverage. And they're not wrong that it complicates your position. But there's a counterargument. He paused. The lien was taken against the property by the legal owner, Dorothy, before her death. Her intended transfer to you, the whole case we're making, argues that the transfer supersedes subsequent claims. The lien was her debt. Your claim is based on her gift. Those are two separate chains of interest. Can you argue that? I can argue it. Whether the court agrees depends on how we present the documentation and what weight the judge gives to the intended transfer basis. He paused again. We'd be arguing two things simultaneously, that you legitimately own the building by Dorothy's intent, and that her intent transferred the asset free of a debt obligation that postdated her decision to give it to you. He cleared his throat. It's not the simplest case I've ever made, but I believe it. The third letter came on a Monday. This one wasn't from the Portland firm. It was from a local attorney Marin recognized as someone who handled commercial real estate in North Bend. He was writing on behalf of the same buyer. The offer had been withdrawn. In its place was a demand for resolution of the title dispute within 30 days, following which the firm intended to file a quiet title action asserting the lien as a superior claim. Marin called Tomas Reyes. They're filing, she said. I know, I got the same notice. He was calm in the way of someone who has decided to be calm as a professional stance. This is actually clarifying. An offer you can accept or decline. A filed action you have to meet. It forces the question into court, which is where the documents are strongest. The lien complicates it. The lien is 10 years old and the enforcement window is closing. Their strongest argument is the one about quiet title under the tax transfer, that your $8 purchase only gave you whatever the county had to give, which wasn't unencumbered title. Our strongest argument is Dorothy's documented intent plus the lien's statutory limitations. He paused. There's one more thing I need to tell you. Tell me. I spoke with the clerk at the county recorder's office. The 2006 loan Dorothy took out, the operational capital loan, there are payment records. She made payments on it for 3 years. Then in 2009, the month before she died, she sent a letter to the lender requesting payoff documentation. The letter is in the file. He let that sit. She was trying to clear it. She knew about the lien. She was trying to clean the title. Marin stood in the cannery with the phone pressed to her ear. She died before it was resolved, she said. Yes, but the letter establishes her intent on the lien the same way the deed establishes her intent on the transfer. She was methodical, Marin. She thought this through. Vera read about the quiet title filing in the notice Marin brought her that afternoon. She read it twice with the measured attention she brought to anything involving consequences. This is why they were watching the property, Vera said. They knew about the lien, they've been waiting to see if anyone would show up to fight for it. Did they expect me? I doubt they expected you. She folded the notice and handed it back. Most people who buy properties at tax auctions for $8 don't have the history you have with this building. They expected an investor or a developer, someone who'd see the lien as a liability and sell. She looked at Marin. The community testimony is going to matter. For the lien, for everything. The court is going to weigh Dorothy's intent against a financial claim. The financial claim has documents. Your side has documents too, and it has people who knew what Dorothy meant to this place and what this place meant to her. That's not nothing, that's the heart of it. The firm that sent this letter, Vera said, looking at the second letter, is based in Portland. The buyer they represent builds mixed-use commercial waterfront. She set the letter on the table. They bought a property in Astoria 2 years ago and it was a fishing operation for 100 years. Now it's condominiums and a wine bar. She folded her hands. I know what this is. Can they challenge the deed? They can challenge anything. The question is whether it holds. Vera looked at her. The deed isn't filed yet, you need to file it. It's not signed, Dorothy didn't sign it. No, but there's a way around that. The lawyer's name was Tomas Reyes. He practiced in North Bend, a 20-minute drive north, in a 2-room office above a hardware store with a waiting room that smelled like old paper and coffee. He was in his early 50s, with reading glasses he kept losing on his own desk and a manner that suggested he'd seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. Marin laid out the documents on his desk. The unsigned deed, the letter of intent from the original transfer, Dorothy's letter, the photographs, the receipts. Tomas Reyes put on his reading glasses and read everything. He read slowly and completely, turning each page the same way. When he was done, he took his glasses off and set them on top of the photographs. How much do you know about unilateral deed transfers? He said. Nothing. A deed that was prepared but never executed, never signed and filed, is legally incomplete. Under normal circumstances, it would be invalid. He turned the letter over in his hands. But there's a body of case law around intended transfers, particularly in estate situations, where the grantor clearly intended to convey title and prepared the documentation, but died before execution. Oregon courts have recognized valid transfer intent in several cases where the intent was unambiguous and supported by documentation. He tapped Dorothy's letter. This letter is remarkably clear. She names you by name, describes the property, specifies the transfer as unconditional, and references the deed explicitly. The receipts establish a long-standing relationship of beneficence and support. The photographs corroborate it. He looked at Marin over the documents. I can't guarantee a court would recognize this as an executed transfer, but I believe there's a legitimate legal argument to be made, and the argument is strong enough that the firm in Portland will know it too. They mentioned quiet title. Their leverage. If the deed isn't formally recognized, they can challenge your ownership under the tax transfer. You got the property for $8 because the taxes were delinquent, but that kind of tax sale doesn't convey full clear title on its own. They know that. He paused. But a court filing asserting the intended transfer claim will cloud the title in the other direction. It puts them in a position of uncertainty too, and their buyer won't close on an uncertain title. So we file, and then we wait to see if they push. He picked up his glasses again. There's one other thing. He slid the photographs back toward Marin. The photograph of you and Dorothy, the inscription on the back. He waited while she turned it over. She'll be fine. That was written in 2008, the year Dorothy prepared the deed, the year she sealed the freezer room. He looked at her steadily. She was putting things in order. She knew she was putting things in order. The sequencing matters. Marin looked at the photograph. Herself at 5, held by a woman she couldn't remember holding her. File it, she said. He filed on a Friday. The firm in Portland responded the following Tuesday. They did not withdraw. They filed a counterclaim disputing the validity of the intended transfer and asserting the tax sale had conveyed only limited title. Their brief was 40 pages and cited 11 cases. Tomas Reyes read all 40 pages on a Wednesday morning. He called Marin and said, "They're worried." "How can you tell? 40 pages is worried. 20 pages is confident." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Marin kept working. The cold storage compressor came back to life after the marine mechanic tracked down parts through a supplier in Astoria and installed them over a long weekend, refusing payment in a way that made clear no payment would be accepted. The roof was solid. The power was restored. The processing tables were scrubbed to bare metal that caught the light from the new bulbs in the overhead fixtures. She'd been selling from the stockroom. It started by accident. A woman who'd come to watch the roof work asked about the jars on the east wall, and Marin had sold her two of Dorothy's 2003 albacore without thinking about whether she had the right to. But the deed was filed, even if not yet recognized, and the jars were on the shelf, and the woman had pressed cash into her hand with the focused eagerness of someone who had been looking for that exact thing. After that, word spread. People came to the loading dock on Saturday mornings and bought what was left of Dorothy's preserved stores, and Marin spent weekday evenings in the stockroom following Dorothy's recipes, learning to put up what the coast produced. Dungeness crab from the co-op. Smoked salmon from Dwayne's son, who had started fishing the same grounds his father had fished. Sea beans from the shore road flats where Dorothy had harvested for decades. Her first batch of relish was wrong. Too sweet, not enough brine. She made a note in Dorothy's notebook in pencil, my first attempt, November, and tried again. Her second batch was close. She made a note. Her mother arrived on a Thursday with a bag and a face that showed the particular expression of a person returning to a place they weren't sure they'd left correctly. She stood on the loading dock and looked at the bay and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she went inside. Marin showed her the stockroom, the notebooks, the mason jar of receipts. Her mother held the receipts one by one in both hands the way you hold something you weren't sure was real. She recognized the handwriting on the utility bill. She'd seen it once, she said, on a birthday card that came when she was 23 with a $20 bill inside and no explanation. She'd kept the card for a decade before a move lost it. She'd always thought it might have been Dorothy, but had never been certain and hadn't wanted to call and be wrong. She sat at the processing table for a long time with the receipts spread in front of her. She didn't want me to feel indebted, her mother said. No, I would have come back if she'd asked me. I would have, I know. Her mother looked at her. You have her hands. Marin looked at her own hands. The photograph says I have Grandma Helene's hands. Both, her mother said. I always thought you had both. They worked together the rest of the day, her mother moving through the stockroom with the ease of someone remembering a body's knowledge she'd filed away long ago. The salmon season, the jar sizes, the way to coax a tight lid without breaking the gasket. Dorothy had taught her in a summer 3 decades earlier, and the knowledge had lived in her hands ever since, waiting. The hearing was on a Wednesday in December. Marin drove to the county courthouse in Vera's truck, which had become a reliable instrument of things that needed doing in her life. Tomas Reyes met her on the steps. Her mother came. Vera came. Dwayne came. B came. The marine mechanic Gerald Ash drove over from Bandon. The retired electrician's son came. 2 of the women from the fish processing co-op came in their work clothes, having come directly from the morning shift. The developer's firm had sent 2 attorneys and a client representative, a man in a fleece vest with a company logo on the chest, who looked at the building with the practiced indifference of someone who needed the room to believe he hadn't driven 4 hours for something he was uncertain about. He counted the people on Marin's side of the gallery with a quick scan and then looked at his phone. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than formal. Wood paneling, 8 rows of benches, a raised bench where the judge sat with his papers organized in the way of someone who had read them completely before walking in. Tomas Reyes set his documents on the table in the order he would present them. The opposing counsel arranged their 40 pages. The judge let both sides present fully. Tomas Reyes went first. He walked the judge through Dorothy's letter, the deed, the receipts, the photographs in the sequence he had planned. He walked through the 2009 payoff letter Dorothy had sent to the lender, the one that established her intent to clear the title, and explained the statutory limitations on lien enforcement under Oregon's Commercial Code, which the opposing firm had filed within the window, but only just, and which, he argued, could not supersede a documented beneficial transfer that predated the lien's enforcement. He cited cases. He was precise and measured and took exactly as long as was needed, which was 40 minutes. The opposing counsel presented their 40 pages in 25. Then the judge said he would hear community statements. This was not standard. Marin didn't know he would do this. She looked at Tomas Reyes and he gave the small nod of someone who had anticipated it and hadn't wanted to oversell. Vera spoke first. She'd been coming to that cannery for 20 years, she said. Dorothy Solis had fed 47 people from that loading dock one Christmas and never asked to be recognized for it. The building was a working place and a giving place, and it had always been both. She said that as simply as she said everything, without performance, and sat down. Dwayne spoke second. He said that Dorothy had given him a contract in 2004 that kept his family housed through a winter when every other buyer in the county had cut their rates to the floor. He said she'd done it because she said his catch was quality and quality deserved a fair price, and if nobody else was going to pay a fair price, she would. He said that was the kind of person who left things to the right person. He sat down. B. Margulies said her grandfather had talked about Solly's Pacific until the week he died, and that the women she employed on her crew were the granddaughters of people Dorothy had kept in work when the industry contracted, and that some debts were worth paying twice. Gerald Ash said simply that he had driven from Bandon to be here, and that he thought the court should know the building had been restored by people who wanted it restored, and had come without being asked. One of the co-op women said Dorothy had taught her daughter to can fish in the canneries last years, for free, because the girl had expressed an interest, and Dorothy believed expressed interest was the most important qualification. Her daughter now ran a small food operation in Newport. The judge listened to all of it. He made notes. He was the kind of judge who let people finish. When the last person sat down, he looked at the documents for a long time, then he looked at the opposing counsel. "The lien," he said, "walk me through the enforcement basis." The opposing counsel did. They were thorough. The lien was real. The acquisition chain was documented. The enforcement window, while narrow, had been met. The judge nodded. He looked at Tomas Reyes. "The 2009 letter," he said. Tomas Reyes presented it. Dorothy's handwriting. Her explicit request for payoff documentation. The framing of the lien as something to be cleared. The judge looked at both documents for a moment. "The court finds," he said, "that the commercial lien, while technically within its enforcement window, cannot be asserted as a superior claim to a beneficial transfer that was documented and intended prior to the lien's original execution." Dorothy Solly's prepared the deed and transfer documentation in 2008 and sealed it with explicit instructions. She took the lien in 2006 and sought to extinguish it in 2009. The intent in both cases was the same, to pass the property free and clear to the named recipient. The lien was an operational matter. The transfer was an act of will. He set down the document. Regarding the intended transfer, the court finds Dorothy Solly's intent unambiguous and the documentation sufficient under Oregon case law. The property at Tilden Road, Coos County, is hereby recognized as conveyed to Maren Lynn Solly's. The lien is extinguished by the transfer intent documentation and the expiration of the enforcement period, which ends, he looked at the calendar, in 4 days. The deed is ordered filed. This matter is closed. The fleece vest man made a note on his phone and left before the ruling had stopped echoing. Outside, on the courthouse steps, December light came through the marine layer at an angle that turned everything silvery white. Maren stood on the steps and listened to Vera say something about lunch and her mother saying something about the drive back. She heard both without hearing either. She had a building. She had a name. She had 30 years of someone's careful preparation, waiting in a freezer room she hadn't known to look for, and then 8 more months of people who had come without being asked to make sure the preparation hadn't been wasted. She thought about what it costs to hold open a door for someone you're not certain will ever arrive. She thought about a $20 bill in a birthday card. A utility payment that looked like a county program. A recipe notebook in a cannery stockroom, waiting for someone with the right question to come and read it. Tomas Reyes shook her hand. He refused payment on the grounds that Dorothy's letter had moved him in a way he couldn't account for professionally, and that was payment enough. "I'll send a jar of relish," Maren said. "Make it 2, he said. She drove back to the cannery along the coast road with her mother in the passenger seat, both of them quiet in the way of people who have just watched something become real that they'd been holding carefully in their hands. The loading dock light was on when they pulled up. Vera had come ahead and started coffee. Through the bay door, Maren could see the processing tables lit, and the shelves lined with Winter's jars, the labels in her own handwriting now alongside Dorothy's, same masking tape, same blue ballpoint. She'd learned to write the labels the same way. She hadn't tried to. Her hand had simply settled into the same slant. She went inside. The coffee maker hissed in the stockroom, the good sound of something working. Vera poured into mugs that now included some without lighthouses, a set of plain white ones Maren had found at the thrift store on Main Street. Her mother sat at the processing table and wrapped both hands around her mug. The 3 of them sat together in the lit cannery with the bay outside and the fog coming in over the water. "What happens now?" Vera asked. Marin looked at the shelf of jars, her labels beside Dorothy's. The notebooks open on the corner of the table. The gloves still turned sideways on the processing table near the door. I make something, she said. 6 months later, the dogwoods weren't there. This was the Oregon coast, not the Blue Ridge. But the wild currant was blooming along the shore road, and the first Chinook of the season had come in through the channel, and the cannery smelled the way it had once smelled, the way a working building smells when it's doing what it was built to do. The sign above the loading dock had been repainted. Marin had done it herself on a Saturday in April, mixing the same forest green that showed in a photograph of the original signage she'd found in Dorothy's notebooks, tucked between a recipe for smoked rockfish and a note about lid gasket suppliers. She'd painted it freehand on a Saturday while her mother watched from a camp chair on the dock. Solly's Pacific. The same letters Dorothy had painted, the same color, the same dock. Different hands. The Saturday market was her own idea. Every week, from 9 to noon, the loading dock opened to whoever came. The preserved goods sold steadily, the smoked albacore and the Dungeness crab and the relish, which she'd finally gotten right, a fact Vera confirmed with the particular emphasis of someone who had been waiting patiently for that confirmation. She'd started teaching a canning class on Thursday evenings, working from Dorothy's notebooks and her own 6 months of learning. 8 students the first week. 12 the second. She'd had to borrow a second table from the food pantry. There was a girl who came to the third class, maybe 19, with the specific combination of competence and exhaustion that Marin recognized from the inside. She showed up on a Tuesday asking if there was work. Marin asked her what she knew how to do. She listed things quickly, the list of someone used to inventory, used to proving usefulness before being allowed to take up space. Marin stopped her. Can you drive a van? Yes. Are you housed? The girl's face went careful. There's a room in the back, Marin said. Nothing fancy, running water and a stove and a lock on the door. You can stay while you're working. She paused. It used to be my great-aunt's room. It's been empty too long. The girl looked at her the way Marin had looked at Vera the first morning she'd walked into Harbor Light, with the measuring expression of someone who has been surprised before and has learned to measure before they trust. What's the catch? No catch, Marin said. Great-aunt helped my mother once, a long time ago, and didn't tell her. Then she helped me without knowing she was going to, and she'd been gone for years before I got here. It moves forward, that's all. She watched the girl consider this. What's your name? Marin asked. Petra. I'm Marin. She held out her hand. Come on, I'll show you where the coffee is. In the evenings, after Petra had gone upstairs and the dock door was locked, Marin sat at the processing table with Dorothy's notebooks and her own. She made her notes in pencil. She recorded what worked and what didn't, the way a season went, what the catch looked like and how it held. She wrote the names of the people who had helped her and what they'd brought and what they'd said. One evening she wrote Dorothy's name at the top of a page and held the pen for a while. Then she wrote, she left a door open. I walked through it. That's what a door is for. She closed the notebook and left it on the table beside the work gloves that still sat where Dorothy had placed them, still turned sideways, still waiting. Outside, the fog was coming in off the water the way it always did, low and steady, turning the dock light into a soft bloom against the dark. The sign above the bay door caught the edge of the glow. Solly's Pacific. It was lit. Some doors don't need locks. They need someone willing to walk through. That's the whole of it.